You are not overlooked when you are silent. You are actively being misread, and that misreading works in your favor. Silence does not explain itself. It refuses the obligation to clarify. In a psychological environment saturated with expression, explanation, and defense, the absence of response becomes an anomaly. An anomaly is automatically weighted. It draws interpretation without offering guidance. This is where authority begins, not as dominance, but as asymmetry. Most internal systems are trained to equate expression with relevance. To speak is to signal presence, to mark participation, to request recognition. Silence interrupts this exchange. It withholds the expected cue. The mind observing it cannot complete its predictive loop. It searches for motive, competence, intention. In that search, power is projected outward. Authority emerges not from what is asserted, but from what remains unclaimed. The paradox is immediate and uncomfortable. Silence appears passive, yet it provokes activity in others. It appears empty, yet it generates narrative density. This contradiction destabilizes perception. When no justification is offered, the observer supplies one. When no weakness is exposed, strength is assumed. The absence of visible effort is misinterpreted as control. Internally, silence is often experienced as restraint. Externally, it is interpreted as certainty. This divergence is the core psychological tension. The silent state feels neutral or even vulnerable from within, yet it is decoded as elevated from without. Authority forms in this gap between internal experience and external attribution. It is not claimed, it is assigned. The mind is structured to resolve ambiguity. When confronted with withheld information, it defaults to status-based inference. If someone does not explain, they must not need to. If someone does not react, they must not be affected. These assumptions are not logical. They are regulatory. They preserve the observer's internal hierarchy by placing the silent presence above the need to prove. Silence does not compete. It does not negotiate meaning. It removes itself from the economy of justification. This removal creates pressure. Others feel compelled to fill the space. They speak more. They clarify. They qualify. Each additional explanation shifts the balance. The one who explains positions themselves as accountable. The one who remains silent remains unaccounted for. Authority accumulates where accountability is absent. There is no intention required for this effect. Silence does not need confidence to function. It only needs consistency. The moment silence becomes reactive or apologetic, its structural advantage collapses. Authority here is not a trait. It is a pattern perceived over time. The internal paradox deepens. Remaining silent often feels like withholding safety. The impulse to speak arises from a need to regulate discomfort, reduce uncertainty, to regain equilibrium. Yet yielding to this impulse transfers authority outward. Speaking too soon restores symmetry. Silence preserves imbalance. This is why silence feels risky. It resists closure. It delays resolution. Human perception is biased toward resolution. Unfinished interactions create cognitive tension. Silence sustains that tension. The observer attempts to discharge it by interpreting meaning, motive, and depth. In doing so, they elevate the silent presence beyond what was ever asserted. Authority here is not earned. It is inferred. The psychological system does not ask whether silence is strategic, thoughtful, or accidental. It only registers the absence of reactive behavior. Absence becomes composure. Composure becomes competence. Competence becomes authority. This chain operates beneath conscious evaluation, yet the silent individual experiences none of this elevation directly. Internally, there is no applause. There is only restraint. The mind remains aware of all the responses that could have been given, all the clarifications withheld. Authority exists only in the perception of others, not in the feeling of self. This creates a split. External elevation, internal neutrality. The split is unstable. It invites contradiction. The silent state must be maintained without feedback. There is no confirmation that the effect is working. There is only the continued choice not to resolve the tension. This choice is often misinterpreted as calm. In reality, it is endurance. Silence does not assert superiority. It allows others to assign it, and that assignment is fragile. It depends on the observer's projections, not on any inherent quality. The moment silence is broken, The illusion is tested. Words reintroduce symmetry. Explanation invites evaluation. Authority dissipates as soon as it is named. This is the unresolved paradox. Silence creates authority precisely because it never claims it. The instant it seeks recognition, it collapses into participation. The mind senses this, even if it cannot articulate it. That is why silence is rarely sustained. It demands tolerance for ambiguity without reward. It offers influence without ownership. It positions the self as a surface onto which others write meaning, without control over the script. And so the question remains suspended, whether the authority created by silence belongs to the silent one at all, or only to those who imagine it. Silence is not empty inside the mind. It is densely occupied. While nothing is expressed, perception remains active. Sensations are tracked. Micro-evaluations accumulate. The absence of outward response does not indicate absence of internal movement. It indicates containment. This containment is not calm by default. It is regulation under load. Internally, silence functions as a delay mechanism. Impulses arise and are intercepted before translation. Words form, then dissolve. Emotional reactions surface, then are held in suspension. The system remains alert, but output is restricted. This restriction alters internal narration. Most minds narrate themselves continuously. Thought becomes speech even when unspoken. Silence interrupts this reflex. The inner voice is forced to compress. Meaning must be held without articulation. This creates pressure. The pressure sharpens perception. Without expression, perception has no release. It turns inward. The mind begins to observe itself observing. Emotional responses are detected earlier, before they reach behavioral threshold. This early eye detection changes regulation. Instead of reacting, the system monitors. Monitoring replaces discharge. This shift creates a sense of enclosure. Thoughts circulate without exit. Emotions cannot externalize to stabilize themselves through feedback. The usual loop of expression and response is severed. Regulation becomes self-contained. This is efficient, but isolating. Silence alters temporal perception. When no response is given, time stretches internally. Moments feel longer. The mind fills the gap with anticipatory modeling. Possible outcomes are simulated. Interpretations are rehearsed and discarded. The internal environment becomes crowded with unrealized trajectories. Externally, this appears as composure. Internally, it is saturation. The silent state demands continuous inhibition. Each withheld response requires energy. The cost is subtle but cumulative. Unlike expression, which discharges tension through movement, silence retains it. Regulation becomes maintenance rather than release. Emotional self-regulation under silence relies on suppression without denial. The emotion is acknowledged internally but not enacted. This creates a split between experience and behavior. The system learns to tolerate emotional presence without resolution. Tolerance becomes endurance. Over time, this endurance recalibrates the threshold for action. Fewer impulses cross into behavior. The internal filter tightens. This is often mistaken for control. It is more accurately described as narrowing. The range of allowable expression contracts. Narration adapts accordingly. The internal story becomes quieter but denser. Instead of explaining, it categorizes. Instead of justifying, it records. Language becomes internal shorthand. Meaning is stored rather than communicated. This storage creates weight. Silence forces the mind to carry its interpretations alone. There is no external correction, no confirmation, no contradiction. The internal narrative becomes self-referential. It loops back on itself, refining without exposure. This refinement increases coherence but reduces flexibility. Without external input, assumptions harden. Perception becomes internally consistent but less permeable. The silent system grows precise and closed. Emotional regulation follows the same pattern. Feelings are managed through containment rather than exchange. There is no mirroring, no resonance. Regulation becomes solitary. Solitude here is structural, not situational. The authority, attributed to silence externally, is mirrored internally as responsibility. When nothing is said, everything is held. The mind becomes the sole custodian of meaning. This creates a sense of internal pressure that is not visible, but persistent. The system adapts by reducing emotional amplitude. Peaks are flattened to maintain control. This flattening is not numbness, but compression. Emotion exists, but within tighter bounds. Compression increases stability, but reduces relief. Over time, the internal environment begins to resemble a closed room. Everything necessary is present. Nothing escapes. Thoughts circulate. Emotions settle into layers. The system functions, but air is limited. The absence of expression removes friction, but also removes ventilation. Silence sharpens perception of others while dulling awareness of self-expression. Attention turns outward to monitor impact, inward to maintain restraint. There is little space left for spontaneous movement. Regulation becomes vigilance. Vigilance sustains authority externally, but internally it confines. The mind adapts to this confinement by normalizing it. A lack of expression becomes baseline. The internal weight is no longer noticed as strain, but as structure. This normalization is subtle and rarely questioned, yet the enclosure remains. Silence does not free the mind, it organizes it inward. The authority perceived outside is mirrored by an internal narrowing. Control increases, range decreases. The system becomes efficient, contained, and isolated. Nothing escapes. Nothing resolves. The mind remains intact, regulated, and enclosed within its own silence. An impulse does not announce itself as a threat. It presents as necessity. Within silence, impulse collides with self-image. The urge to speak, correct, assert, or react arises as a pressure toward coherence. The internal image of control resists it. This resistance is not moral. It is structural. The system has invested in restraint, and any movement risks exposing instability. Impulse is movement seeking discharge. Self-image is stability seeking preservation. Silence turns this opposition inward. Without expression, the conflict cannot externalize. It circulates. The impulse is not eliminated. It is delayed. Delay transforms urgency into friction. The longer the impulse is held, the more it presses against the image that contains it. The self-image formed around silence depends on consistency. To remain silent is to remain aligned with the internal narrative of control. Any deviation threatens the coherence of that narrative. The impulse therefore becomes not just a desire to act, but a threat to identity. This escalates the conflict. Suppression is often misinterpreted as strength. Internally, it is experienced as negotiation without resolution. Each impulse is evaluated against the cost of expression. Expression risks collapse of perceived authority. Suppression risks accumulation of pressure. Neither option resolves the tension. Both maintain it. Control begins to feel unstable. The silent system monitors itself continuously. It scans for cracks. It tracks impulses as potential failures. This monitoring amplifies the salience of impulse. What might have passed unnoticed in a more expressive system becomes a focal point. The impulse grows by being watched. Self-image tightens in response. Standards increase. The threshold for acceptable expression rises. The gap between impulse and action widens. This gap is not empty. It is filled with internal friction. Friction generates heat without movement. The system begins to equate impulse with loss of control. The mere presence of desire to speak is interpreted as weakness. This interpretation is not accurate, but it is functional. It maintains silence by reframing impulse as risk. Over time, this reframing alters perception. Impulse is no longer a signal to be understood. It is an intrusion to be managed. The internal relationship with impulse becomes adversarial. The system does not ask what the impulse contains. It asks whether it can be contained. Containment replaces integration. The self-image relies on suppression to remain intact. Each successful suppression reinforces the narrative of control. Each suppressed impulse becomes evidence, yet this evidence is unstable. It requires repetition. One release would invalidate the accumulated pattern. This creates fragility. Control appears solid externally because it is maintained internally through constant effort. The effort is invisible. The system cannot relax without risking exposure. Silence becomes both armor and constraint. Impulse adapts. It does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes less obvious, more persistent. It manifests as cognitive loops. Internal arguments, imagined explanations that never surface. The energy of impulse redirects inward. This redirection fragments attention. The mind splits between maintaining image and managing impulse. Neither side fully resolves. The image demands consistency. The impulse demands release. The system oscillates without movement. Stability becomes static tension. Static tension is mistaken for calm. As suppression continues, the system's confidence in control paradoxically increases and weakens simultaneously. Increased confidence comes from repetition. Weakening comes from dependency. Control exists only as long as suppression continues. There is no margin. The silent self-image cannot tolerate error. This intolerance sharpens internal judgment. Minor impulses are treated as significant threats. The system becomes vigilant against itself. Control shifts from capacity to compulsion. Silence is no longer chosen. It is enforced. At this stage, impulse and self-image no longer negotiate. They collide. The impulse pushes harder. The image tightens further. The system feels rigid, yet strained. There is no outlet. Control begins to fracture internally while remaining intact externally. The fracture is not dramatic. It is subtle. It appears as hesitation, delayed response, internal fatigue. The system remains silent, but the silence feels heavier. The cost of suppression increases. The self-image depends on silence to exist. The impulse depends on expression to resolve. Neither yields. The system sustains the conflict by maintaining silence, but silence no longer feels neutral. It feels loaded. Loaded silence amplifies impulse. The more silence is used to preserve authority, the more impulse is charged with destabilizing force. Each impulse carries the weight of potential collapse. This weight is not proportional to the act. It is proportional to the identity invested in not acting. The conflict narrows the system's range. Only two states remain: suppression or rupture. There is no intermediate expression. Control becomes brittle. Externally, nothing changes. Internally, alignment erodes. The self-image remains intact, but less believable. The impulse remains contained, but less manageable. The system holds both without resolution. Silence persists. Control persists. But beneath persistence, something has shifted. The balance no longer feels stable. It feels contingent, maintained, held together by continuous restraint. The system senses this instability but cannot articulate it without breaking silence. Awareness remains implicit. The conflict remains active, and the silence continues, fractured within itself, holding impulse and image apart, neither integrated, neither released, suspended in a state that cannot fully sustain itself and does not yet collapse into. The pattern is sustained by a belief that is rarely articulated, even internally. It is the belief that exposure diminishes position. This belief does not present as fear. It presents as prudence. It frames itself as protection, not avoidance. Silence is chosen not because expression is dangerous, but because expression is seen as unnecessary. The system learns to equate necessity with vulnerability. What must be said is already compromised. This belief forms early and stabilizes quietly. It does not announce itself as a rule. It emerges as an assumption about how influence operates. Those who speak are managing perception. Those who do not are presumed beyond it. The belief does not evaluate truth. It evaluates hierarchy. Silence becomes insulation. The belief sustains the pattern by redefining safety. Safety is not found in clarity or understanding. Safety is found in distance. The less one reveals, the less one can be positioned. The belief does not claim that silence is superior. It claims that silence is invulnerable. This is not irrational. It is adaptive. In environments where evaluation is constant, opacity reduces attack surface. Silence limits data. With limited data, others rely on inference. Inference tends to favor stability. The belief recognizes this tendency and uses it. It does not seek admiration. It seeks uncontested ground. Authority here is not dominance. It is non-engagement. The belief frames expression as exposure to interpretation. Interpretation is loss of control. Silence, by contrast, restricts interpretation to projection. Projection can be managed indirectly. Exposure cannot. The belief, therefore, treats silence as containment of meaning. Containment feels protective. Internally, this belief does not feel like avoidance. It feels like discipline. The system does not say, "Do not speak." It says, "There is no need." This distinction matters. Prohibition creates resistance, dismissal creates compliance. The impulse to speak is not fought, it is downgraded. This downgrading is subtle. The belief positions silence as the default state of those who are secure. Those who speak are responding. Those who are silent are deciding. This framing elevates silence without naming it as such. The system internalizes this hierarchy without conscious endorsement. Once internalized, the belief self-reinforces. Each instance where silence is followed by deference, hesitation, or projection confirms it. Each confirmation strengthens the association between silence and safety. The belief becomes less about authority and more about preservation. Preservation becomes identity. The belief does not deny the cost of silence. It reframes the cost as necessary. Emotional compression is interpreted as maturity. Internal tension is interpreted as composure. The system accepts internal strain as evidence of strength rather than as a signal of imbalance. This reframing is protective. By treating the belief as protective rather than false, the system avoids self-critique. There is no accusation. There is no judgment. The belief is doing its job. It is preventing perceived loss. It is maintaining position. It is minimizing risk. Risk is defined narrowly. Risk is not emotional discomfort. Risk is loss of standing. Anything that threatens standing is filtered. Silence becomes the most efficient filter. It blocks not only threats but also variability. Variability is unpredictable. Predictability feels safe. The belief prioritizes predictability over connection. This does not register as deprivation. It registers as order. The internal world becomes organized around restraint. Each withheld response reinforces the structure. The belief does not ask whether something could be gained by expression. It asks, what could be lost? Loss aversion dominates. The belief does not need to be true to function. It only needs to feel coherent. It aligns with observed outcomes often enough to remain unchallenged. When silence coincides with perceived authority, the belief is validated. When silence coincides with misunderstanding, the belief interprets this as acceptable collateral. Collateral is tolerated. The belief protects against humiliation, misinterpretation, and dependency. It keeps the system self-contained. It reduces reliance on external validation. This reduction feels stabilizing. The system becomes less reactive to others because it has reduced points of contact. Distance is mistaken for independence. The belief does not demand that silence be constant. It demands that silence be available as a defense. Knowing that silence can be deployed at any moment creates a sense of control. This sense of control is calming. It reduces urgency. It slows impulse. The belief therefore appears benevolent, yet it carries an unexamined assumption that authority must be defended at all times. That once lost, it cannot be regained. That expression is irreversible. That interpretation is permanent. These assumptions are not evaluated. They are inherited. The belief does not ask whether authority is fragile. It assumes it is. This assumption creates vigilance. Vigilance maintains silence. Silence maintains authority. The loop is closed. The belief sits at the center, quietly justifying the pattern without drawing attention to itself. There is no moment of recognition, no realization. The belief remains. Unnamed, functioning beneath awareness, framing silence as safety, distance as control, restraint as wisdom. It does not announce itself as belief. It simply feels true. And because it feels true, it is rarely examined. It remains intact, protective, efficient, and unchallenged. Even as the system begins to sense a faint uncertainty beneath the order it maintains. The cost of silence is not immediate. It accumulates quietly. At first, nothing appears to be lost. The system functions. Interactions proceed. Authority is maintained. The absence of expression feels neutral, even efficient. There is no visible deficit. What is not discharged does not announce itself as damage. The erosion begins beneath awareness. When expression is consistently withheld, certain internal signals lose their outlet. They remain contained, then normalized. The system adapts by lowering sensitivity. Emotional nuance becomes less differentiated. Reactions flatten not because nothing is felt, but Because feeling has no destination. Over time, this containment alters internal calibration. The mind becomes accustomed to carrying unresolved states. Tension without resolution becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces urgency. What once demanded attention becomes background. Background pressure is easily ignored. The long-term effect is not collapse. It is thinning. Emotional experience becomes narrower, not absent, but reduced in range. Peaks are rare. Valleys are shallow. The internal world stabilizes at a low amplitude. This stability is functional. It allows continuity, but it also limits depth. Silence gradually disconnects internal experience from external reality. Because nothing is expressed, nothing is mirrored. Without mirroring, emotional states lack confirmation. They exist, but without reinforcement. Over time, the system stops checking for resonance. Resonance fades first. The cost is subtle detachment, not from others, but from one's own immediacy. Feelings are recognized intellectually before they are felt somatically. The body responds less vividly. The mind observes more than it inhabits. Observation replaces participation. This shift is rarely dramatic enough to trigger concern. It feels like maturity, like steadiness. The system interprets reduced reactivity as progress. The quiet erosion is misread as refinement, yet something is missing. Silence also affects memory. Experiences that are not expressed are less integrated. They remain episodic, unshared, unprocessed. Over time, they lose narrative coherence. Life feels continuous but less storied. The past becomes flat. Authority remains intact externally. Internally, however, the sense of continuity weakens. Moments blend, distinctions blur. The internal archive is sparse not because nothing happened, but because nothing was marked. Expression marks experience. Without marking, meaning erodes. The system retains facts but loses texture. Emotional memory becomes abstract. This abstraction creates distance from one's own history. The cost is not pain, it is dullness. Silence also reduces friction, and friction is a source of vitality. Without friction, movement slows. Desire becomes muted. Motivation becomes procedural. Action is taken because it is required, not because it is charged. Charge dissipates. Over years, this dissipation registers as a vague sense of loss. Not a specific absence, but a thinning of presence. Something once available feels farther away. The system cannot name what is missing because it was never acknowledged. The loss is pre-verbal. The belief-sustaining silence interprets this cost as acceptable. Authority is preserved. Stability is maintained. There is no obvious failure. The system continues to function competent and contained, but the internal economy has shifted. What is preserved is position. What is lost is immediacy. This loss does not provoke alarm. It provokes quiet recognition, a sense that something has been traded, even if the terms were never discussed. The recognition is fleeting. It does not demand action. It lingers as a faint awareness beneath the order. The system notices that silence has taken more than it gave, but only slightly. Enough to be felt, not enough to disrupt. The erosion continues without urgency. Authority remains, control remains, and somewhere within the maintained structure, a subtle awareness forms that the silence which once felt protective has gradually reduced something that cannot be easily recovered, only noticed after it is thinned. Awareness does not arrive as control. It arrives as distance. The system does not suddenly regain range. It does not release impulse or dissolve restraint. What changes is position. The mind steps back from its own pattern without stepping out of it. Silence is still present, but it is no longer invisible. This awareness is not analytical. It does not dismantle belief or expose error. It simply notices structure, the way silence has been used, the way authority has been inferred, the way restraint has organized the internal world. Nothing is challenged. Nothing is corrected. Distance creates space without movement. From this position, silence is no longer identical with identity. It is recognized as a strategy rather than a self. The system sees that authority emerged from perception, not from essence. This recognition does not weaken authority. It weakens attachment to it. Attachment loosens quietly. Awareness observes the loop without interrupting it. Silence still delays response. Others still project. Authority still accumulates. But the internal meaning shifts. Silence is no longer fused with safety. It is one option among others. even if it remains the default. This distinction matters, and silence is no longer the only structure holding the system together. It loses some of its internal pressure. Restraint becomes less compulsive. The system does not need to defend silence as identity. It can simply use it. Use replaces necessity. Awareness also reveals the cost without dramatizing it. The thinning of immediacy is noticed without urgency. The loss is acknowledged without grief. Recognition does not demand reversal. It only registers reality. Reality is not negotiated. This awareness does not seek expression. It does not correct misunderstanding. It does not reclaim what was withheld. It allows silence to remain, but without the same internal compression. The system no longer needs silence to prove. Control. Control is no longer the objective. From this distance, impulse is seen differently. It is no longer an intrusion or a threat. It is a signal that can be noticed without being acted on or suppressed. The conflict between impulse and self-image softens. Neither needs to win. Softening does not mean release. It means that suppression is no longer loaded with identity. The system can hold impulse without interpreting it as destabilizing. Silence becomes less brittle. Authority becomes less defended. Defensiveness recedes first. This shift does not produce clarity. It produces tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for misinterpretation. Tolerance for the possibility that authority might fluctuate without collapsing the system. Fluctuation becomes survivable. Awareness recognizes that authority was never owned. It was always assigned. This recognition does not create insecurity. It creates proportion. Authority is no longer absolute. It is contextual. Context reduces pressure. The silent system remains largely unchanged in behavior. Words are still chosen carefully. Responses are still delayed. Expression is still minimal. But the internal posture is different. Silence is no longer holding the system together alone. The system holds itself. This awareness does not resolve the long-term cost. It does not restore lost immediacy. It does not recover texture or resonance. It simply acknowledges that something was exchanged. Acknowledgement is not repair. Yet, something shifts when the exchange is seen clearly. The system no longer needs to justify it. Silence is no longer framed as superior or necessary. It is simply what has been done. This neutrality reduces internal friction. With reduced friction, the internal environment becomes slightly more permeable. Not expressive, but receptive. The system listens to its own signals without urgency. It does not rush to interpret or suppress. Listening replaces vigilance. This is not mastery. There is no sense of command. Awareness does not confer power over silence. It creates separation from it. Separation allows choice to exist, even if it is rarely exercised. Choice does not need to be acted on to exist. In this state, silence continues to function as it always has externally. Authority still forms in its wake. Others still project. The pattern remains intact, but internally, the system is no longer entirely defined by it. Definition loosens. The subtle philosophical shift is not toward speaking, but toward seeing. Toward noticing how meaning has been managed through absence. Toward recognizing that authority was created without being claimed. This recognition does not instruct. It does not advise. It simply invites a different relationship with silence. Not as armor, not as identity, but as a space that can be occupied without being inhabited completely. Silence remains. Authority remains. But the system is no longer fully inside either. And in that slight distance, unresolved and open, there is room for something unnamed to exist alongside restraint, without needing to replace it or dismantle it, only to be noticed as possible.